In the darkened passages of the Vatican, blood-stained and filled with secrets towards the end of the 15th century, one individual manipulated the world's holiest organization into something much more sinister. This was no simple reign. It was a masterclass in corruption so immense that even contemporary crime syndicates would pale in comparison. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, an individual who would ascend to become Pope Alexander VI. But he rose not by divine will. He purchased the throne with gold, deception, and blood. Before we examine the atrocities that rocked the Christian world, consider this. What occurs when heaven's gates are governed by a devil in disguise? The year was 1492. While Columbus traveled west in search of new worlds, an altogether different journey was taking place in Rome, a plunge into darkness under the leadership of a man who broke every holy rule of the Church. Rodrigo Borgia didn't merely play the system, he blew it apart, remaking the papacy a throne of sin propped by murder, incest, and an avalanche of bribes. This isn't a story of salvation or sanctity. It's a dreadful account of how symbols of holiness were turned into weapons. Borgia made religion an arm itself, poisoning his enemies, employing his daughter as political fodder and supposed mistress at the same time, and sending out his son as blood-drenched warlord. With cold ambition, Pope Alexander VI demonstrated that when morality is a luxury, even the Church can be a hell on earth. And yet, what is more frightening, an evil-doing man, or one who makes holiness his cover-up? Even in Renaissance, Italy's reputation for corruption, Borgia was unique. His premeditated practice of assassination, the scandalous rumors of incest with daughter Lucrezia, and the blatant sale of sacred offices created a template for tyranny. His plan was not chaos, control. Every crime had a function, every sin tightened his control. With murder, scandal, and riches, he established a regime that compelled even his adversaries to fall to their knees. Historians and eyewitnesses were amazed. The Venetian ambassador noted that Alexander surpassed all previous popes in his greed for power and disdain for divine law. And yet, many could not help but admire the outcome. He exercised absolute authority and enlarged the Church's domain more than any of his predecessors. How did he accomplish this? How did a man so odious come to control a world founded upon faith? The solution is in the way he used salvation symbols to turn into weapons of terror. The cross as a tool of domination, the papal tiara as a crown of thorns for his enemies. And the Vatican itself? No longer a house of faith, it was a fortress for his criminal kingdom. This is the tale of how one man corrupted the Church. Not just that, but he made paradise hell. It all started with the papal conclave of 1492. What was supposed to be an assembly of godly men seeking divine guidance became a public auction where power was bought and sold to the highest price. Rodrigo Borgia had waited for this moment for decades. He amassed untold riches, not to serve God, but to purchase him. Picture this. The doors closed, cardinals in crimson robes huddled together, not saying prayers, but bids. While Pope Innocent VIII was on his deathbed, Borgia moved into action. Behind the walls of Roman palaces, he secretly received cardinals individually, exchanging bags of gold for allegiance and offering lands, offices, and unlimited favors. His most lavish bribe? 4 mules loaded with silver for Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, along with the vice-chancellorship of the Church and domination of a rich bishopric, an offer worth more than some kingdoms altogether. That payment set off the floodgates. Other cardinals scrambled to cash in their votes, knowing the hesitant would be left in the cold. Borgia wasn't simply paying cash, he was paying protection, lifelong income, influence, and impunity. He made them co-conspirators in his corruption, guaranteeing their silence. It wasn't bribery, it was blackmail with gold. They became his once they accepted his offer. Before the conclave started, it had become a circus. Cardinals openly compared bribes as merchants compare wares in a market. It was written by the Venetian ambassador in incredulity that the Holy Spirit did not have a role in this election, only greed. And when the ballots were tallied, Rodrigo Borgia had done the impossible. He had bought the throne of St. Peter. Contemporary estimates place him at over 100,000 ducats, millions in today's money, to crown himself Pope Alexander VI. And then what? A church-turned-mafia, a ruler draped in robes of virtue, concealing daggers behind. Within a few days of coronation, Alexander VI started disbursing his debts. Church positions were doled out like rewards. Power was auctioned to the highest bidder. Loyalty was rewarded. Betrayal was punished, sometimes with death. The Vatican lost its stature as a center of spirituality and became more of a syndicate headquarters. Rodrigo Borgia had established one thing beyond a shadow of doubt. In Renaissance Italy, even the voice of God was for sale, provided one paid the right price. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, didn't wait to convert the Vatican into a fortress of fear. And his greatest terror weapon? It wasn't a sword or an army of soldiers. His was poison. A mysterious and deadly substance known as cantarella was his silent killer. Quick or slow, depending on the message he desired, it guaranteed obedience through fear. Imagine a time when the Pope's dinner invitation promised you the possibility of not waking up to see the dawn of a new day. Cantarella was reputed to be a white powder, soluble in wine or food, invisible until the victim's body writhed in pain. The sickness appeared natural initially, but the agony was gruesome and lethal. This was no senseless violence. It was planned, political killing masquerading as divine vengeance. Cardinal Giovanni Michiel, one of Borgia's earliest critics, paid the ultimate price. After publicly denouncing the Pope's corruption, he was invited to a private Vatican meal. Within hours, he was dead. The message rang clear across Christendom. Oppose Alexander VI, and you'll receive a final supper, laced with death. It wasn't just about killing. It was about spectacle. The Pope made his enemies die as examples, living warnings to the rest. They died overnight. Others died from slow poisoning, languishing for days or weeks in the public eye, testimony that the Pope's influence was irresistible. Not even family members were safe if they became obnoxious. Chroniclers started recording a dark pattern. Whoever defied Alexander mysteriously ill-fared, wasted away, and perished. The fear was suffocating. Diplomats, cardinals, and nobles shook in his presence. The Venetian ambassador joked cynically, "Those who dine with the Pope should prepare their souls for heaven." In Rome, a shared cup was a death warrant. Worse were the shattered souls than the dead bodies. Under Alexander, fear reigned more totally than faith ever could. What made this reign of terror even more sinister was the way that it corrupted holy rituals. Chalices used in Holy Communion were now instruments of assassination. Papal blessings now came wrapped in silent menaces. The benevolence that Christ had commanded was now a facade for premeditated killing. But that was just the start. Alexander VI did not only poison bodies, he poisoned the soul of the church itself. He made the Vatican a business empire where salvation came at a price. Cardinalships, bishoprics, indulgences, all for sale. He made the church a marketplace and himself its CEO. Did you ever stop to think how much it was to buy one's way into heaven? Alexander VI had a price list. A cardinal's mitre might be bought for 10,000 ducats. A bishopric, occasionally, as little as 1,000. These were not bribes, investments. Purchasers gained lifetime revenue through church taxes, tithes, and privileges. Church positions were sold like property, building a huge spiritual franchise of faithful customers. Worst of all, the people purchasing these offices were frequently completely unqualified. Men who'd never been sworn in, who kept mistresses, who had no knowledge of Scripture or doctrine, were promoted to the top of Christendom because they had the ability to pay. The College of Cardinals was turned into a brothel for merchants and politicians. The Church, which had once spoken as the voice of God, now only spoke the tongues of gold. And it didn't end there for top posts. Even indulgences, sin, forgiveness, were on the market, bought and sold as commodities. The rich could actually pay their way out of hell, leaving the poor behind, tied to moral law that they could no longer afford to obey. This engendered a spiritual caste system. Eternal salvation, promised to all believers, became a luxury good, affordable for the affluent alone. The Church's divine promise was twisted into a profit scheme. Consequence? An eroding foundation of faith throughout Europe, as one saw heaven's gates open wide only for the affluent. Alexander's corruption was not limited to the Vatican walls. His agents worked on the continent, from London to Constantinople, selling religious books, taking fees, and building his network like a mafia cartel. Local bishops and priests became regional managers, collecting commissions from every sale. All corners of Europe were affected. Church attendance fell off. Education stagnated. Spiritual leaders were replaced by wealthy power brokers. Millions of Christians were left abandoned, their shepherds now salesmen. And at the eye of this storm stood Alexander's most potent weapon of all, his son, Cesare Borgia. Where Alexander was the mind, Cesare was the sword. Cesare was not a man of the Scriptures. He was a warlord, a ruthless commander, bred to do his father's bidding by blood. Bankrolled by church gold and supported by papal bulls, Cesare unleashed terror throughout Italy. Cities were conquered. Enemies were killed. Lands came under the control of the Borgias, not by sanctity, but by terror. Alexander sent out papal bulls pronouncing these brutal campaigns as holy deeds, transfiguring murder into mission, war into divine justice. Father and son created a regime in which religious authority and military mastery merged. It was no longer God reigning from the Vatican. It was the Borgia family, through poison, through sword, and through gold. When Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope Alexander VI, divine power was his instrument of conquest. In a sweep of his pen, he signed papal bulls staking claim to whole territories in the name of the Church. And then, like a divine battering ram, his son Cesare Borgia would move in and capture those territories by conquest. Anyone who dared resist pronounced heresy against God himself. This was not mere war. It was a religious crusade shrouded in blood, fear, and intimidation. Cesare's strategy was new. He didn't require large armies. He relied on precision, terror, and mind control. He would enter a city with a small elite army, then eliminate the leadership quietly. Poisoned wine, mercenary blades, staged accidents. After the city's leadership was removed, the cowering populace would capitulate without resistance. One of his most chilling deeds was in Sinigaglia. The Romagna lords had given hints of revolt after they first yielded to papal domination. Cesare invited them to a grand banquet as a mark of appreciation. They came in peace. Before dawn, all of them were strangled. The message was unmistakable. Betrayal would be punished with death, and no one ate with the Borgias without peril. Fear was not a byproduct of Cesare's campaigns. It was the campaign itself. He used early guns, organized spy rings, and teams of professional killers. His personal guard, elastically loyal Spanish soldiers hand-selected from his father's native country, performed clandestine killings and black ops. Their silence rendered the assassinations untraceable. Cesare's war machine was sustained by the wealth of the church. Indulgent sales, plundered monasteries, and tribute from conquered cities filled the treasury. One victory paid for the next. Bishops were instructed to fund military campaigns. Sacred treasures were plundered to fund war. The spiritual mission of the church was supplanted by an engine of insatiable expansion. And recall, struggling against Cesare wasn't merely opposition to a general, it was opposition to the Pope. Opposing him was heresy. No army was strong enough to resist the combined might of sword and sanctity. Alexander and Cesare together cut through Italy like a knife cuts parchment and annihilated anyone who dared get in their way. But war terror wasn't the only scandal that surrounded the Borgia name. Arguably, the most notorious and chilling aspect of Alexander's rule was his relationship with his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia. Slander of incest wasn't spoken under the breath. It was used as a tool of coercion. Political gossip, indeed, but uncomfortably realistic ones, nurtured for the specific purpose of keeping friends in line and foes shaken in fear. What father makes his own daughter a chess piece in the most grotesque game of politics this century? Lucrezia's marriages were chess moves in a dark game. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, was forced to declare himself impotent in a public humiliation so that the Pope could annul their union for political convenience. It wasn't just cruel, it was calculated, a warning to all: cross the Borgias, and you'll lose not just your titles, but your dignity. Scandal widened when Lucrezia bore a child of dubious parentage. Pope Alexander VI asserted the boy as his grandson, but the world wondered otherwise. Was he the father or the grandfather? The uncertainty was deliberate. The Pope desired to have people guessing, speculating, cowering. Even Lucrezia's body was used as a political pawn. Contemporaries observed odd behavior. She spent her life within the Vatican at the control of her father without privacy, surrounded by rumor. The Venetian ambassador reported that His Holiness shows more affection to his daughter than is proper. Such observations weren't rumor. They were intelligence utilized for blackmail and domination. What do you do when your secrets are so dark that even your enemies are too afraid to expose them? The incest rumors were not only depravity, power. They demonstrated to the world that Alexander VI felt he was above all human law, even the most profound moral prohibitions of Christian civilization. His rivals feared for revenge. His partners feared it was their turn next. Lucrezia herself was both victim and accomplice. Held within a machine she assisted in powering. Her marriages were treaties of state. Her pregnancies were kept as secrets of state. Her heartbreaks were manipulated into tools of state. She played the game her father designed, surviving by wit and stoicism in a world dominated by manipulation. The scandal extended far beyond Rome. European courts had to contend with a pope whose actions broke every moral rule, and yet he maintained absolute spiritual authority. The paradox gave Christendom an earth-shaking jolt, prelude to revolution. Protestant reformers would go on to use Alexander VI as the living embodiment of corruption at Rome. When the scandal is the Pope himself, who has the courage to defend the Church? But Alexander VI's greatest creation wasn't a person. It was a network, a sprawling web of fear that stretched across Europe like a shadow. This wasn't random tyranny. It was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly effective. The Pope and Cesare had an army of spies, assassins, and informants who worked at every large European court. Their work wasn't merely observation. Bribes were paid, threats were issued, and men were murdered to keep the peace. Possible foes were silenced before they ever posed dangers. Scandals were uncovered and employed as daggers. You didn't merely need to watch your back. You had to expect that the Vatican already knew your secrets. These agents were not outsiders. They were ingrained within governments, churches, and aristocracy. And they didn't just work for the Church, they worked directly for the Borgia family. The system was so tight that even those who knew of the Pope's blackest sins feared to utter a word, for one whisper might cost them a poisoned goblet, a tarnished reputation, or a body floating in the Tiber. Alexander VI had constructed not only a corrupt papacy, but a worldwide engine of terror, a system so extensive and so creepy that opposition itself became unimaginable. Once Alexander VI had grabbed the papacy, an eerie silence fell on the Vatican. Cardinals who had once thundered against corruption now spoke in hushed tones, their voices overwhelmed by fear. Not because their beliefs had altered, it was because they had witnessed what became of those who were brave enough to speak. It was no longer a court of God. It was a theater of complicity, where the truth was hidden under robes of silence. Alexander's genius wasn't simply in annihilating his foes, but in converting them. By attracting cardinals into his plots, compelling them to sit through salacious affairs, participate in dirty transactions, and accept bribes, he turned them into co-conspirators. To stand against him would be to reveal themselves. He transformed upright men into silent criminals. Outside the Vatican, his network expanded throughout Europe like a sprawling, intangible empire. In the shadows of castles and cathedrals, Alexander's agents spoke in hushed tones, handed over coins, or dropped poison into goblets. Dressed as merchants, pilgrims, or ambassadors, these agents crept into every great capital. They generated intelligence, bribed nobles, blackmailed bishops, and assassinated those who strayed from the path. From Budapest to London, kings and ministers changed their minds in fear, because all of them thought Rome was observing. And they were correct. The psychological fear was more potent than any sword. Aware that the Pope's eyes and ears were everywhere, nobles ceased meeting in secret. Their conversations were coded. Letters were burned. Even those exempt from threats acted with restraint, afraid they'd be next. The Church had once preached salvation. Now it preached surveillance. Even the roots of Christianity were distorted beyond all recognition. The next papal elections weren't divine interventions. They were fixed auctions. He rigged conclaves, securing for his loyalists positions of power in the future. His posthumous legacy of corruption would live on then, no longer a papal scandal, a continent-spanning conspiracy, braided through the very center of Europe's religious and governmental frameworks. Kings, emperors, dukes, they were no longer monarchs. With Alexander's domination, they became co-conspirators in a criminal enterprise posing as sacred government. France was among the first to fall into his control. King Charles VIII patronized Alexander's bloody campaigns in exchange for land concessions and papal approval. Foreign policy in France changed, not in the interests of its people, but to further Borgia ambition. French troops fought not for France, but to expand Rome. The sacred concept of Christian monarchy crumbled under the onslaught of gold and corruption. Spain itself was also drawn into the Borgia intrigues. Alexander's Spanish background gave him access to Ferdinand and Isabella, the very same monarchs responsible for the Inquisition. In comparison to him, even their sinister policies seemed moderate. Gold from the New World, intended to finance holy endeavors, was subtly diverted into the Pope's coffers. Spanish warriors were incorporated into papal legions. The Vatican now possessed worldwide clout. Behind Spanish steel and American silver, even the powerful Holy Roman Empire bowed to his power. Emperor Maximilian I, though entitled and powerful, found himself negotiating with a pope who disregarded Christian law but still spoke of God's will. Each agreement undermined imperial strength while building the papal hold over German territories. Italy, divided into rival city-states, was the ideal battleground. Alexander would set one group against another. He'd provide one with military aid, spiritual approbation to another, and annihilate both if it was advantageous to him. Assassination, threats, and bribery became the accepted instruments of diplomacy. City by city, Italy was sliced into fragments, and each fragment deposited into the hands of a Borgia or his supporter. Florence, Milan, Naples, Venice, none were left unscathed. Puppet rulers occupied thrones placed there by papal authority. Opposition was answered with poison, not mercy. Even rumors of discontent were sufficient to bring destruction. Ultimately, Alexander VI corrupted not a church or a continent. He corrupted the concept of holiness itself. He demonstrated that the most holy institutions could be purchased, corrupted, and used as weapons. That was not piety, but power which governed Rome. And for a period of time, that power was in one man's control, a pope as deadly to souls as he was to wine. The Church, once a source of hope, became under Alexander VI the darkest empire of all. The most horrifying outcome of Alexander VI's reign wasn't just personal corruption. It was how he poisoned the very soul of Christian unity. The Church, meant to unify Europe under a common moral vision, was transformed into a criminal empire that turned Christian nations against each other, all to feed the ambitions of one family. Wars were no longer waged for principles or faith, but for papal profit. Diplomacy across international borders became a means for criminal syndicates. Treaties were entered into not in the name of peace, but of influence. Far-off kingdoms succumbed to Borgia manipulation. Succession struggles, commercial alliances, wars, everything was polluted by the long reach of Rome, where agents of the Pope played the roles of spies rather than shepherds. The papal nuncios, formerly messengers of unity, were converted into intelligence officers. Legates were not reporting on religious advance, but on potential threats. Alexander VI had successfully commandeered Christendom's lines of communication and transformed them into a surveillance state. It wasn't merely corruption. It was tyranny, in its most strategic, purest form. Alexander's rule became a blueprint that would be copied by tyrants for centuries. His expertise at terror, sex scandal, and economic manipulation taught future dictators just how power could be amassed, not with the prize of winning hearts, but with the price of shattering them. His legacy destroyed the very heart of the Catholic Church. It would take decades to remove the grime his rule left behind. The scandals ignited the Protestant Reformation. The reformers, outraged at Rome's corruption, pointed specifically to Alexander VI as the best example of how the Church had gone astray. The Counter-Reformation was in large measure a reaction against his debasement, a desperate effort to sweep clean after the Church's blackest night. The world politically would never be the same. Alexander VI had shown the unimaginable, that even holiest institutions were available to be purchased, bullied, or warped to the will of a single man. The Pope had been revealed not as a sacred shepherd, but as a hard-nosed political operative. Kings learned Rome was for sale. The Holy Throne of St. Peter became a pawn in politics in Europe, one more crown on a continent of tainted power. It was a revelation that abetted the growth of absolute monarchy and increasingly weakened the Church's hold on temporal matters. But most unsettling lesson was also the most perilous. Absolute moral abandonment succeeds. Alexander VI did not rise to power despite his sins, but because of them. His application of incest, murder, and rampant bribery wasn't merely appalling, it worked. In the harsh world of politics, he demonstrated that those who are willing to forego all morality can do what the righteous cannot. And people took notice. His psychological hold reached far beyond the Vatican. Throughout Europe, they ceased to believe in the sanctity of the Church. A cynicism took hold, one that would span generations. If the Pope himself is a criminal, how is anyone going to believe in the sanctity of the institution? This wasn't merely a leadership crisis, it was a crisis of faith. Modern historians still study his tactics. Why? Because they're alarmingly relevant. His techniques, buying loyalty, silencing enemies, creating self-policing systems of fear, remain part of the dictator's playbook to this day. Alexander VI's reign was a masterclass in institutional corruption. He turned the cross into a weapon, the blessing into a curse. Salvation itself became a business transaction. Heaven had a price, and the Pope was the broker. And what he marketed was not less than the soul of Christendom. His triumph was no accident. It was the culmination of a well-planned campaign. He built a religious mafia, trading saints for hitmen, confession for coercion. Bishops were bagmen. Mass became drama. The Church was a syndicate. His foes could not stop him because they were caught in his web. Mutual guilt was the armor that shielded his empire of fear. Nobody could bring him down without implicating themselves. This was the game of complicity that made it impossible to resist. It was the final system of domination, a tyranny sustained not merely by violence, but by generalized corruption. And it succeeded. The corruption infected like a virus into royal courts, merchant guilds, universities, and monasteries. It infected all levels of power until nothing was sacred. Unity disintegrated. Europe no longer shared one church. It shared a battlefield of ideologies, shattered by one man's lust for power. The Pope had not become a shepherd of souls, but a plague-bearer of corruption. Alexander VI's legacy is perhaps the darkest in human history. He showed how absolute power, when mixed with absolute immorality, could turn paradise into hell. And what's worse, he made it look effortless. He armed the sacred, he peddled salvation, he made the Holy See a seat of sin. The man who was supposed to be Christ on earth became a godfather in a cassock, a grand puppet master whose corruption was so absolute, so systematic, that it remade the world irreparably. His tale is not merely a cautionary history, it is a cold reminder. When there is no check on power and morality is abandoned, there is no institution too sacred, no symbol too revered that cannot be turned into an instrument of malevolence.